Welcome back, everybody here with us at the conference and everybody who is watching this stream live. We are back after a short break for another very, very packed part of this program. We are starting the afternoon program now, and you can still, of course, reach out using the hashtag IFF Paris. We're going to be able to see your comments and your questions and to bring some of those here on stage. And we're now going to go into two parallel sessions, two parallel streams, one on corporate financing and another one that's going to be happening right here in a few moments on stage is on sustainability. And it's my great pleasure to invite here on stage for a fireside chat, moderator Tuba RAQSHAN.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Sasha, for that introduction. Since we have very little time, I'll be going directly into the topic, which is sustainability. And I have the great pleasure of introducing our guests today. On my left is Verena, Chair of the European Financial Regulator, ESMA, and next to her is Robert OPHELE, Chair of the French Financial Regulator, AMF. Thank you, Verena and Robert, for joining us today. So without further ado, I would like to get to the topic, to the main point. I'd like to start off with the subject of greenwashing, which has been flagged by the industry and the regulators alike. So I'd like to start this with you, Verena. What is your take on the state of greenwashing today, and what steps has ESMA taken to tackle this?
Thank you very much, and thank you to Europlus for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. Greenwashing is one of the key topics that we are currently working on as ESMA. It's quite a complex and multifaceted issue in a way, and therefore linked to the growing demand for sustainable products and by the great interest, particularly of retail investors, to get into these type of products to support the sustainable transition. We have, as ESMA, made the fight against greenwashing and beyond that, greater transparency in this space, one of the key areas of our strategy, which we outlined in the Sustainable Finance Roadmap that we published. One of the things that has happened is there's a lot of legislative activity underway at the European level, but it is also clear that that will only increase transparency and comparability over time. So part of the question is, what do we do in the meantime where the demand is growing rapidly, but we don't have all the legislative puzzle pieces in place quite yet? And so what we are trying to do together with the national competent authorities is trying to, on the one hand, work on the implementation of the various legislative proposals, making sure that there is, as far as possible, transparency and comparable data available, but also making sure that we start implementing that on the ground and that there is supervisory follow-up by the national competent authorities. That's not always easy. It's quite a difficult task to undertake, but we are certainly committed at ESMA also to provide further clarification and explanation and guidance to try to help the convergence implementation of making sure that particularly retail investors are able to fully understand what the possibilities are for investing in a sustainable transition and how they can contribute to that. It will be something that will require a lot of further work. We are not there yet, but it is something that certainly is very top of our priority list.
Thank you, Verena. And turning to you, Robert, what are the measures that the AMF has taken so far?
First of all, we should recognize that accusation of greenwashing is to a large extent an easy blame, since almost everyone has his or her own definition of what is or should be green. So to some extent, if you want to avoid any reproach, you will just invest in niche products to avoid any blame. So let us be prudent on what is really greenwashing. I should say that pending the harmonized and relevant European framework, Verena has mentioned, we have tried at national level to develop our own approach on both what should be disclosed by corporates and on what should asset managers comply with when they are selling ESG funds in our market. Early 2020, just before the start of the pandemic, in order to support the momentum in favor of sustainable finance and ensuring the conditions for trust, we have released what we call in France a position recommandation, which is a bit more than a recommendation. It's please, you should enforce that, you should comply with, on information to be provided by collective investment schemes incorporating non-financial approaches. More precisely, I will not give you the full picture, but if non-financial criteria are a key aspect of the fund communication, for example, through its name, the naming is part of the story, the fund should comply with some minimum standards in France. The fund approach of ESG matters should be binding, with measurable objectives. The commitment should be significant, and we have provided some quantitative example of what significant means. For example, if there could be a reduction of the investment universe by at least 20% if you have a selectivity approach. And we have also covered the case of the possible use of total return swap in ESG funds. And we are now carrying out on-site controls on the fulfillment of this requirement. Obviously, this should be a transitory approach pending the adoption of, at European level, of an harmonized regulatory, supervisory and enforcement approach. I take the three of them because regulation is interesting, but if you do not supervise and enforce, it's worth nothing. And because national approaches are, in essence, in contradiction with the single market and the free provision of financial services throughout the Union. But this harmonized approach is not yet here by far, and SFDR is of no help in this perspective. We are very much in support of to ESMA to develop this harmonized approach, and the naming issue is a good challenge to see if we can make progress in that direction at European level.
Robert, you've mentioned the European level where there are several evolutions happening at the same time. I'd like to talk about the different approaches that there are currently. On one side, when it comes to non-financial reporting, we have the EFRAG, which has been mandated under the CSRD to come up with its own reporting standards, but you also have the Anglo-Saxon approach, which is by the ISSB. So, Robert, I'd like to start with you on this. Which do you think is more ambitious? Is it usable? How do you look at this?
Appropriate corporate sustainability reporting is a prerequisite to any well-informed sustainability investment, and is key to protect from greenwashing, we have just mentioned a few minutes ago. European companies will start reporting under the CSRD framework you have just mentioned in 2025 on 2024 reporting period. That's a very good news and a great achievement for the French presidency of the Union, we should say. Let us be clear, international standards are a must. They are a must, provided they are relevant and effectively implemented in all major jurisdictions. And the mere fact that both the international standards proposal by the ISSB and the European EFRAG one occur simultaneously, not mentioning also, we should also mention the SEC, US SEC proposal at the very same times. It shows that we stand at a juncture where we should and can do the maximum to strive the convergence and interoperability between the different frameworks on the basis of a shared, strong international baseline. Nevertheless, we have seen with the accounting standards that it is very challenging to elaborate truly international standards. And the comments received by the SEC on its own proposals illustrate that the adoption of ISSB standards by the US is far to be granted. Taking into account the fundamental divergence between the double materiality promoted in the EU and the financial materiality only centered on the enterprise value put forward by the SSB, the aim at this stage is to converge as much as possible on the general concepts and used in both frameworks, and especially in the climate segment. Standard setting is a long journey, and the co-construction should be pursued in order to avoid market fragmentation at the end of the journey. But there is also the risk that both standards are not interoperable enough, even on similar concepts, and that it would lead to confusion and double reporting. We should try to avoid that by, for instance, on the definition of transition plans. We should have in mind that the European standards require that we will build up on a Paris-aligned transition scenario for 1.5 degrees Celsius in 2050. The ISSB remained vague on that. If it's different, correct, we have an issue. Possibility or not to present carbon offset as a mean to achieve GHG emissions reduction target, that's not allowed by EFRAG. It's still a bit vague at the ISSB, to say nothing about the tendency in the US to skip disclosure on scope 3 emission of greenhouse gases. If they are not there, it's worth nothing. That's absolutely clear. So taking into account these difficulties, the EU stance of developing its own standards, but trying as much as possible to work hand in hand with the ISSB, this is the right stance. We will know at the end of this year if it's successful or not. Let us try.
And Verena, do you share Robert's worry about the difficulty in interoperability on making these two standards work together?
Certainly, I very much share his view that it will be very important that we try as much as possible to find a common baseline and at international level. After all, the sustainability transition is not something we can solve just in Europe. It's a global issue, and we need to find ways across jurisdictions to try to move forward. So I'm very much in a common line with Robert on that. I also believe that the ISSB has made a good starting point in at least getting going very quickly at international level to try to put some standards out there for consultation. I think this is now the time indeed to try to find commonality between what is going on at the international level and at the European level. It's clear that interoperability would be much more appreciated, not only by investors who will look at different reporting standards, but also by internationally active companies who otherwise will have a significantly increased reporting burden if there is no interoperability. So from both those perspectives, I'm very clear that that is the desired outcome. And from that perspective, indeed, all efforts should be made to try to find common solutions. At the same time, I think Europe has moved ahead quickly in trying to deal with the sustainability challenge, and therefore Europe needs to continue to move ahead. And clearly Europe will go further than some of the international standards. That's also clear, whether it's regarding the double materiality point, whether it's regarding the question that it will go beyond climate and environment, also to social and governance objectives. It is ESG, after all, that Europe is trying to move on. So I think there will be things where clearly Europe wants to go further, and I think that's perfectly fine and good. But if we can do that on a common baseline, I think that would be much easier, so that at least there's full comparability that can be achieved.
And talking about ESG, Verena, I think ESMA has been looking closely at the ESG ratings sector, and especially with regard to the divergence among different providers on these ratings. So could you tell us a little more about what is your perspective on this, and what would we be seeing over the next few months in this area?
basically, we already at ESMA wrote in January 2021 to the Commission, sharing our views on the main challenges in the area of ESG ratings and assessment tools that are available. And we highlighted that there's a need to match the growth in demand for these type of products with appropriate regulatory requirements to ensure quality and reliability. And following that, there has been further work, both actually also at an international agenda through the IOSCO Sustainability Task Force that set out some principles in this area, but also in Europe we've moved further. And so the most recent thing that we've done is actually launch a call for evidence where we received information on market structure for ESG rating providers in the EU, as well as the cost of possible supervision and what we should focus on if there is demand for a regulatory regime. ESMA, through that, has identified about 59 ESG rating providers active in Europe. It's quite a precise number, and I'm sure it's changing by the day, but and it's largely for-profit providers that are in this space. We found that the market is composed of a small number of quite large, mostly non-European headquartered providers, and a large number of smaller EU headquartered providers. So it's a quite uneven and varied landscape. What we are also, through the call of evidence, have seen is that people, the users, use these ESG rating products for very different purposes. So it's also important that what is clear when these products are provided is what's the methodology that's standing behind it, what is it actually trying to measure, and therefore what can it help you as user try to explain and help. We clearly see a need for these type of products, particularly for smaller financial services firms who will not be able to really assess all of the varied data and information that will be there, but it will be important that they are properly supervised and regulated to ensure there is the quality, there's transparency, and there are no conflicts of interest.
And Robert, do you have the same opinion?
Absolutely. And by the way, we disclosed an opinion with the Dutch AFM on this issue 2-3 years ago, advocating for what precisely ESMA is supporting now. And I think it's very important. There is similarities and differences between credit rating agencies and ESG rating agencies. For credit rating agencies, you have an acid test, which is the rate of default. Because at the end of the day, if your methodology is wrong, you will see it obvious. That will be obvious for everyone. And when you compare rating for credit rating agencies, they are highly correlated between themselves. When you look at ESG ratings, there is almost no correlation at all between. It means that, in my mind, it means that the regulation, the regulatory framework for ESG rating is absolutely even more necessary for ESG ratings than for credit rating agencies. What does it mean? It means transparency of methodologies, management of conflict of interest, relationship with the issuer you are rating, to some extent perhaps location of the teams. That's need to be done. And but at the end of the day, it will be the same thing that for the credit risks management. Investors should make their own due diligence. They can't just rely on the rating of ESG ratings. They should take it as an input, but make their own assessment of the consistency of the investment with what the ESG indicators are telling them. So it will be complementary the same way it should be for credit rating.
And coming to the next part of my question, this is on the Rapport Perrier, which is recommendations on putting Paris as a leader of the climate transition. So I'd like to start with you, Robert. What do you think of the Rapport Perrier? And do you think that we need another climate transition label.
Wonderful report. I think the author himself will be best placed to answer your questions. But let it put it that way. If I'm not mistaken, Yves, there are 24 different recommendations in your report. So I will not discuss 24 recommendations of them. It just demonstrates the commitment of the Paris Financial Center to this issue, and the commitment for issuers, investors, banks, insurers, all the scope of the market players are totally dedicated to make progresses in that direction. Just a quick comment perhaps on one issue which is very sensitive because it's linked to the retail customer, which is the ESG labeling, which is quite difficult to handle. It's a real challenge because if you try to be straight to the point, you should avoid that Carib and Scylla. One is to be too broad and catch up, and the other is to have a niche product. And to some extent, what I've heard at European level is more something like a niche product than something which could really finance the transition we need. So that's something. The devil is in the detail in that case. But let us avoid something which will be of little use.
So you're looking to ensure a credibility. And what would be required to bring that credibility?
At this juncture, if you linked too closely the label with taxonomy, for example, as it is, you will catch almost nothing, which is not the purpose of a label. So this is something which is very tricky to find the right balance. But we would need something at European level. It would be much better than the flurry of national label we have today, even if the French one is quite successful, but nevertheless, it's not easy.
And Verena, do you agree with Robert on this?
I certainly believe also that the topic of labeling labels will be an important one, because what we see already is that the complexity of the information that is available is such that it will be even more difficult for a retail investor to digest. So we need to find something to make it comprehensible. Of course, I would support trying to do that at European level rather than having fragmentation by having 27 or even multitude of labels in each country. It's not an easy task. The devil is in the detail, as Robert said. I think maybe the other point that I would pick up from the report, which was definitely a very interesting read, is the issue of how do we make sure that information is properly available. And I just wanted to mention one other initiative which is happening at European level, which is the European Single Access Point, it's called. And that was particularly designed indeed to provide a framework and basically a European database where sustainability-related information would be available free of charge to the public. And that, I think, will make quite an important change over time if company information is available like that, if people can properly search. Again, it's quite a big task. ESMA has been proposed as the entity that would host basically that European hub that will bring in the data from the national information sources. And I think it's a real opportunity which we should try to pursue.
Okay, and on that note, I'd like to throw the floor open for questions. We have time for maybe just one question, so who will be the lucky one today? I already see your hand there. Could you please introduce yourself?
Olivier Champagne, independent advisor. Thank you for your speech today. I have a question because I don't understand why Europe tried to find an agreement, an international agreement, because somewhere we know that it's quite impossible to find an agreement with the US because economic interests are not the same as in Europe, as in Asia. Then what we don't do the same approach for ESG as for the GDPR, for example, or the digit regulation. I mean, just a European taxonomy without any commitment with other countries or other economic areas.
Verena, would you like to take this one?
I think what we have seen in some of the other examples that you've cited is that you might have then a European piece of legislation in place, but then actually trying to continue to do international commerce in a financial market that is by its nature global creates significant issues. And you then have to kind of work afterwards a lot to try to actually continue to make it possible. So from that perspective, I am someone who certainly believes in a strong Europe. We should lead the way. We should go on and do what we need to do. But at the same time, in Europe that is open and that is willing to discuss and see whether we can't find global and common international solutions. I still believe that is the better way to do where we can.
If I can just add something. If you take the accounting case, these international standards, of course, they have not been endorsed by the US, but they are accepted in the US. Of course, they have not been fully implemented in Japan, but it is an option in Japan to use them. If you do not have any international standards, you're lost. So we need both, but we need to be relatively free to make something which is based on these international standards, but which could be a bit different. And that's exactly what we are pursuing. But believe me, international standards are still very useful, because at some point you should explain why you do not implement them. And if you do not implement that, you are obliged to accept them as an alternative. And I think for all firms, for all company, it's very useful to have that.
And on that note, I'd like to thank Verena and Robert for joining us today. Thank you so much. And over to Sasha now.